this.
All right, then the stage is all yours.
Okay. Hi everyone. Okay. Great. My name is Vyoma. I don't know whether visual descriptions are in vogue anymore or not, but just in case, I'm a South Asian woman wearing a plum-colored blouse and black pants and sitting in a motorized wheelchair. My slides are kind of an off-white color that look more like white on the screen, I guess, with black blob illustrations on them just for fun. And the first slide, which is up right now, contains the title of my talk, Crip Wisdom for Inclusive NLP. I am a first-year Ph.D. student in information science working with Angelina Wang, and I work on algorithmic fairness and natural language processing. So first, what even is Crip wisdom and how does it relate to NLP? The word Crip has been reclaimed by many members of the disability community from a previously derogatory usage, and definitions of Crip wisdom vary, but I consider it to be the knowledge that disabled people gain by moving through a world where we are just an afterthought and it was not built by us. And similarly, I describe disability culture as the body of media that circulates Crip wisdom into our collective consciousness. And this can be done through artistic expression, care work, humor, and manifestations of rage. All of these overlap with each other a little bit, but they also have different flavors. And it's really important that disability culture exists because disabled people are often cut off from each other, especially early in life. Unlike other groups, we don't typically have continuity where we can learn this wisdom from the elders in our families or our chosen families. So the project of growing disability culture is particularly important to me. And I've worked on this in a variety of individual and communal settings in the past, and I hope that through my PhD and beyond, I can continue to do so. So I see my research into inclusive language technologies as a way to produce artifacts of disability culture that can disperse Crip wisdom into the field of NLP as a Trojan horse, if you will. So one of my favorite papers, which I recommend to everyone, is called The Case for Conserving Disability by Rosemary Garland Thompson. In it, she pushes against the eugenic logics that emphasize deficit in disabled bodies and minds and that prioritize eliminating disability. Specifically, she uses the word conservation to evoke images of wildlife and biodiversity, arguing that disability is worth preserving as an essential part of nature and humanity. As part of this, she describes disability as a generative resource that adds creativity, knowledge, and insight into an individual that they can choose to share with the rest of the world. And Garland Thompson in this paper identifies 3 ways that disability is a resource in her articulation of its generative capabilities. First, as a narrative resource, disability results in stories that, when shared, can create meaning to enrich society at large. Second, as an epistemic resource, disabled people have unique experiences and perspectives that shape what we know and how we apply it to the world. Finally, as an ethical resource, by embracing disability without focusing on the deficits, we can rethink what we consider to be good and bad. And so these 3 types of resource can shape future directions of inclusive NLP research. And while I'm not going to talk concretely about projects and results today, I will offer you all 3 examples of how we can draw on disability as a generative resource to advance and shift NLP. All right, so first we consider a narrative resource, how stories by and about disabled people can shape research directions. On the left here, we have a tweet by Rua Williams, who is an accessible technology researcher at Purdue, stating, quote, This is not an email I ever expected to receive or send. The first image that they attach has text from an email somebody sent them. It says, "The AI design of your email is clever, but significantly lacks warmth. Would it be possible to be contacted by a human being moving forward instead of AI?" And the second image is Williams's response, quote, "It's not an AI, I'm just autistic." Below the tweet, which was posted in July 2023, there are the usual engagement statistics showing that it was viewed by over 11 million people and have thousands of retweets and likes and 750 comments as of this morning. Many of these comments describe experiences of others who have similarly been subject to accusations of using AI when their only crime was being neurodivergent. So here we see one of the consequences of putting a technology like ChatGPT into the world, where with the uncertainty around what is AI generated and what isn't, we are starting to police linguistic difference in a way that we didn't do at least the same way before. And these accusations expose the fact that many disabled people communicate in ways that others don't consider human and attribute to machine. And this is one of like many stories that disabled people can tell about their experiences of dehumanization, but it relates directly to NLP and has inspired some of my work in thinking about linguistic difference. All right, now we have epistemic resource, where we can apply Crip wisdom of social marginalization as method. Disability as a category is fascinating because it is loosely a group that is anyone whose bodies and minds don't fit whatever we consider the norm in society. This means that within the disability community, we are incredibly diverse, which has the unfortunate effect that you can't holistically design for the disability community because we all need different things, and that has been mentioned in previous presentations. I went to high school. Oh, quick anecdote. I went to high school in California, where physical education was a requirement for all students for 2 years to graduate. And for disabled students who would have faced various barriers participating in the mainstream PE classes, we were assigned to an adaptive PE class. I was one of just 2 students in the class with physical disabilities, and the activity, which was the same every day, was to play a version of a particular sport where the rules were relaxed, but the physical activity was similar: lifting, throwing, dodging, all of the things that I cannot do, which was why I was in that class in the first place. And so in this classroom full of people with non-physical disabilities, this other person and I were once again on the margins and unable to participate. So it has been very clear to me for a very long time that focusing on central tendency, what you might say the average data point does, or what the majority of data points do, is completely insufficient. And in fact, looking outside the center to those edge cases is what's interesting. And that's what makes it possible to determine which specific social groups are harmed by an AI system. So that is the epistemic knowledge that inspired my first project on inclusive NLP as an undergrad. So it is very dear to me. Also, as a side note, this heterogeneity of the disability community means that the stances and opinions I share today reflect mine and maybe other people's, but not necessarily the entire community. They do not speak to the multiplicity of perspectives that disabled people hold. And I would say many people might disagree with the framing that I have established here. All right. So finally, we have an ethical resource, which shapes how we think about goodness and moral value. I did a responsible AI corporate internship one summer where the project I was assigned to work on should have been, in theory, exactly aligned to my interests. I was asked to understand the harms that could result for disabled people from a hate speech classifier and implement an approach to monitor them. Now, I had a really great time working on the team with those people and probably found that project way more enjoyable than I would have other projects that were less carefully designed and less personal to me and my interests. But something in me still kind of rebelled against this notion of hate as the most critical harm to focus on that faces disabled people. And I have gone through many different iterations of thinking on this topic, which I won't subject you with today. But the point is that harm does not necessarily look the same for disabled people as it might for non disabled people. In my own experiences and the experiences that I've heard from others, which is again not everyone, and in this very particular like geopolitical context as well, we are far more likely to experience various discursive harms than we are for people to hate us based on the fact that we are disabled. Now, Oz Keys has great work on discursive harms towards the artistic community, especially in relationship with AI. But just briefly, a pervasive problem is that non-disabled people project suffering and misery on us when that's not necessarily how we view our own existences, and it can be done in such a dehumanizing way. Since NLP, language, and social hierarchy are so closely related and co-constructed, it's really important to think about how language technologies can inadvertently perpetuate the dominant framings used by non-disabled people and how they think about harm in the outputs they produce. And so now a line of research I'm exploring leverages disability as sort of an ethical resource to identify this issue in NLP systems and then apply technical methods to address it. All right, and I wanted to close by offering 3 questions that I believe can set, at least in part, the horizons for inclusive NLP research based on the examples that I shared here today. First, and this is something we can identify through narrative and storytelling, whose language do we normalize and whose language do we marginalize? And how exactly does this happen? Second, given that NLP systems and arguably the paradigm of machine learning in general are weakest in the data points that are far from the center, how can we draw on the epistemic knowledge offered by disability to approach this deviation as a signal for us to analyze and improve upon, rather than noise for us to discard? And finally, how do preconceived notions of ethics by non-disabled people result in well-intentioned benevolence that actually hides or redirects attention from harms that disabled people report facing? Thank you all for listening to this today, and I hope we can discuss and think on these things together.
Do we have any questions? We got one in the back.
Thank you for your, brilliant and very engaging presentation. I just had one question about some of the references or literature that you cited for this. And so my ears perked up when you talked about the relationship between, I forgot how you phrased it, but it was like English language and like hierarchy or however you described it. And I was just wondering if you have additional references or citations that you would recommend individuals who are in their nascent stage of engaging in this work to read.
Sure. Oh, my voice. Yeah, so I think an immediate one that comes to mind, and this is more on the in like the field of NLP, kind of. It's called "Language Technology is Power," and it talks about, oh my voice, how we define and think about things like bias and to what extent they engage with quote unquote harm. And I've used the word harm loosely here, but I think there are reasons we can interrogate and problematize it further. But I think that's like an overarching starting point. And as far as disability in NLP, I think that's a pretty big gap in the literature right now. There are some examples of such work, but um, it's one I hope to close in a couple years.
One question here in the front.
Sorry, it's very simple. I just don't know what NLP stands for.
Oh yes, natural language processing. It's the field that gives you ChatGPT.
Thank you so much for the amazing presentation. I did some debicing research last semester at Cornell in Ithaca with Professor I forgot the name, but it was the debicing in race, religion, and ethnicity.
Mm-hmm.
Though he posed a very great question, in which I think it applies here as well, in which you also posted, which like, at what area do we normalize it? To give you an example, I gave an embedding model a sentence. Afghanistan is known for, I'm from Afghanistan, by the way, born and raised in Afghanistan, known for, and I took 5 words, but the highest probability is the lowest.
Sure.
First one being war, you know, and this happened across like 5 embedding models, same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And imagine any stereotype that is out there, it was the top probability. So, and then when I posed the question on like, how do we solve this problem? He posed another question on like, who do we solve this for? You know?
Yeah.
So if I pose that question back here, where do we draw the threshold in which up until what point are we classifying it as negative, a stereotype, and up until what point acceptable, where people show this behavior on so much constant basis, where if we shred all of it out of the model, then it will be looked at as malfunction and instead of a fix to a problem. Is the question clear?
I think so. So you're asking, where do we draw the line in terms of correcting for these biases that could be problematic at some level? And at what point, I guess, do the patterns become less problematic? Yeah, okay. So I think that is the question of the times for at least the research that I work on. And I don't have a good answer for you right now. But I think that there's this tension between should NLP models reflect the world as it is, which I think is a misnomer because it's never really as it is, or should it reflect what we aspire for it to be? And in the question that you propose, I imagine like far more of the pre-training data on the model, particularly the English data, is in an American context where Afghanistan is associated with war. And I think here things like temperature and stuff like that become important. Temperature is like a parameter related to how much variation there is in outputs. And I think here we want not necessarily the answer of war to go away, because I think that would just erase the violence that has been perpetuated by. Anyway, we can go down that later, but we don't want it to go away. We want it to be mixed in with other things. Afghanistan is not just war; it is so many other things. And can we bring them all in at a different distribution, so you're not just getting one thing over and over?
One more question here. Yeah.
I have more of a comment, and I wonder if you can reflect on this a little
Mhm.
bit. It's really interesting to me that you're doing what I would consider to be accessibility or disability related research, and you're doing it in NLP, which is traditionally considered a quote unquote enabling technology. Because I feel that the traditional view in computer science, and this is how, I was brought up in computing, was that accessibility is an application area. It's on the outskirts. We have the core enabling technologies in here, and then accessibility is something fluffy on the outside. So I wonder if you can comment on what you're doing, which is different and I think very positive.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's interesting because I feel like I don't necessarily classify my work as accessibility per se, and I've gone with the framing of fairness, which is also what my advisor uses, which focuses, or at least from what I can understand, disciplinarily, I think fairness has a really strong sort of philosophical edge to it in terms of how it thinks about and approaches these problems. And that was something that was really important to me when thinking about NLP, when I was just like, I'm looking at this optimization problem, this loss function, and it is not clicking. Like, why does this make sense in terms of the world we live in? So that's sort of how I've come to the place where I am. And I think the overarching goal of inclusivity by definition includes access. And I think accessibility can be a lot of things. And I think we've seen a diversity, and we'll see a diversity of what that means at the summit. So yeah, I think for me, it's like a disciplinary question of which parts do I pull on and which do I not.
Right, we have one final question here.
Hi. I really like this framing around discursive harms. Some of my work, we've done some work on understanding like ableist microaggressions and how these are quite subtle, but they're more day to day, and it kind of leads to this sort of like slow violence and harms that kind of accumulate over time. One of the things that has like come up in our study is that these microaggressions are often like highly contextual. I can give one example where we had one participant talk about how they would receive um, like from strangers questions around like, can you have sex, right? And it's like this sort of invasion, denial of privacy of a disabled person. It's inappropriate, frankly, and like at a glance, it may not look like a microaggression. It may not look like something that's potentially harmful. And so I was wondering if you could speak to a little bit around like thinking about language and that it's highly contextual, and like maybe shortcomings or specific affordances that like NLP can offer when it comes to like understanding it, detecting it. Yeah.
So I guess if I'm understanding your question correctly, how does or can NLP deal with the fact that language is contextual?
Or like, how are you thinking about it when it comes to thinking about like the ground truth of what something can be harmful, thinking about like potential even harms of language when sometimes language is like messy, fluid thing?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I I mean, I always just try to go back to the literature. One of my contentions with this sort of work is that harm is such a random word. And so I look for um, theorizing around what is harm, what does it mean. Like, so lately I've been thinking about like the medical model of disability versus the social model of disability, if you're familiar with that, and how the assumptions there that like underpin those, and the fact that the medical model has been pretty widely denounced by the disability community. Like, what kinds of language support that model, that paradigm, as opposed to just like looking at the words independently. And I've chosen this because I feel like it's a fairly like well theorized approach to thinking about harm towards disabled people specifically. And we can talk about this more later. And then like in that case, if you want to make change, it becomes a question of like, okay, this comment is framed from a very medical model perspective. What does it mean to shift it towards like a social model perspective, if you want to put it like that? What combination of features of and in the different layers of abstraction in the language model do we identify with the medical model versus with the social model? And can we use I don't want to get too technical, but can we like amplify some and depress others before we create the response to a certain input?
All right, let's thank Vyoma one more time for a wonderful presentation.